Chris Manuel from the Princeton Review is going to go ahead and get started. Are you ready, Chris?
Yep, I'm ready.
Okay, enlighten us, my brother.
All right, do I need to give an introduction again, like last time?
Yes, please, just for those that didn't know you from the podcast.
Sure. So my name is Chris Manuel. I work for the Princeton Review. From the slide, you can see various titles that I've held at one point or currently hold. I've been teaching for 8 years. I'm born and raised in Beaumont, Texas. Went to the University of Notre Dame. I majored in biology there. I have a master's in biostatistics and epidemiology. I'm probably one of the few people that you'll ever meet that's been accepted to medical school multiple times but chose never to go. Something else always came up that persuaded me to not go. So over the past 8 years, since I did not go to medical school, enabled me to keep teaching for Princeton Review, a job I still hold in addition to a full-time job. So the purpose of today's presentation is to talk about some test-taking strategies. Kind of overlaps a little bit with the presentation that I gave earlier this year. It's on the podcast, dealing with MCAT preparation and medical school admissions. So without further ado, we'll get started here. Hopefully my thing's going to work here. All right, so we got general test-taking strategies. So the first thing is, do these actually work? So this is a common question I actually get. People believe that they just need to have content and they can do well on the MCAT. And that's actually a common question for any test type. So unequivocally, the answer is yes, they definitely work. Most tests are designed so that the average student does not finish that test in the allotted time. So we're having to rush through. In fact, in 1997, there's a big study that came out that analyzed how men and women took and did on the MCAT, in addition to other multiple-choice time tests. And they found that timing was the biggest issue. And they found that women tended to second-guess themselves more often and go back to questions more often. And to this day, there's still a discrepancy between the scores that men and women achieve on the MCAT. A study that came out earlier this year from Jefferson College, which is in Philadelphia, basically pointed out these flaws and is one of the major catalysts for driving a renovation to the MCAT. So in a couple of years, we're probably going to see something that's going to come out that's going to change the MCAT in the hopes to minimize this discrepancy between men and women. So test-taking strategies definitely do work. Now, the question is, how do you apply them? And that's part of what we're going to cover today. So my next question I have here is, how can I become proficient with test-taking skills? Well, the first thing you have to do is learn how to do these test-taking skills. I firmly believe that it's pretty difficult to do that on your own. You do need some kind of assistance. Now, that can come in the form of a prep class. That can come in the form of a tutor. That can come in the form of online help. It can be forums and things like that. The MCAT is definitely a test that you do not want to take on your own without any outside help. So my next question I've got here is, how do I manage my time? Okay, now this is a twofold question. So one is, how do I manage my time in terms of preparation for the MCAT? And the second part is, how do I manage my time when I'm actually on the MCAT? So the first question, so how do I manage my time in terms of preparation for the MCAT? The average student spends roughly 300 hours preparing for the MCAT. The question is to any student is, how do you want to spend those 300 hours? Do you want to do it in a shortened time frame? Do you want to do it in, say, a month? Or do you want to spread it out over 2 months, maybe 3 months, maybe even 6 months? The best answer is whenever you can fit it in. Every student has a busy lifestyle. We've got classes, we've got other commitments. Maybe you're older and you've got a job right now and you can't study all day, every day. So you've got to find that time to actually manage, to find the time to even start to manage how you're going to prepare for the MCAT. Now the second part of this question is, how do I manage my time on the actual MCAT? Now that comes down to preparation and forcing yourself as you prepare and do passages to study and use a stopwatch or a clock to gauge your time that you spend on each passage. In fact, what I suggest is whenever you do a practice passage, you jot down how much time it took you. And as you progress in your studies, the goal is to bring that time down that you spend per passage. A general rule of thumb is that you want to spend 2 minutes reading a passage and 1 minute per question. Obviously, that's going to skew a little bit, and that gives you a pretty good basis that you want to try to follow. Okay? So that was my question on how to manage my time. Dan, do you want me to field questions at any point or just keep going?
Just keep going. We'll try to take notes on our questions.
Okay. So next question, is it really true that certain answers are correct more often than others? All right, this is a really popular question that I actually get quite a bit. Statistically speaking, if you look across the MCAT, every answer choice is evenly distributed across all test forms when you average it together. However, there are certain questions that lend themselves to be certain answers. I know most students find this hard to believe, so I actually put a generic example in, which we'll look at right now. So you notice I changed it to specific test-taking strategies. So I'm actually going to put up a question. So here's an example question. Is all the following are true except? Now, granted, we have no content in here at all, and I've got my 4 answer choices. So at the very bottom, I ask, where is the answer going to be? So as a typical pre-med, what you're going to want to do is you start with A, and you try to disprove it. And then you go to B, and you try to disprove it. And then you go to C, and you try to disprove it. And then you go to D, and try and disprove it. And hopefully you've selected your answer by the time you've gotten to that point. Now, what's interesting, when you look at tests, and this is not just the MCAT, it's pretty much any test, more times than not, and pretty much I'm going to tell you, almost always, the answer is going to be C or D. Because as a writer of a question, what I want you to do is to read A, go, oh, A is true, and circle it. And you didn't read what the question actually asked. It said all the following are true except. So what I teach my students to do is instead of just trying to answer that question, on your scratch paper, jot down a note. What are we actually looking for? We're actually looking for the false answer choice. And that'll take you about 10 seconds to do. But by doing that, it helps eliminate silly mistakes. And it makes this overall process significantly easier for a student because now I know what the question's asking and I'm less likely to pick the incorrect answer. Now, as far as a test-taking strategy, what I teach all of my students to do is just start from the bottom and work your way up. It's not always going to work, but it will work many more times than it will not work. And if I'm guessing on this type of question, I'm going to guess C or D. Now, some students find this hard to believe. Through my experience, I've taught about 2,000 students at this point, and I've done all of the MCAT material that's pretty much out there. But I've also taught at the collegiate level. And dealing at the collegiate level, when you deal with multiple choice questions, this is the same strategy that college professors employ, and to a certain extent, medical school professors. So this is a test-taking skill that's not just going to work for the MCAT, but will work for pretty much any test type. So I'm going to do one more example of a question that's kind of has a predictable test type. And we'll get some student interaction, except Heather, you can't answer, because you already know the answer. All right, here we go. So which of the following Roman numerals is correct? Once again, irrespective of content. So we're just looking at question types. So I've given you the 3 Roman numerals. So my question is, which Roman numeral should you approach first? Okay? I'd actually like to open it up. Does anyone have a comment on which Roman numeral you would go through first?
And this was like multiple choice and essays?
No, this is just like there's going to be a content, there's going to be Roman numeral 1, 2, and 3, and you've got to pick which of those 3.
Never mind, I don't have a screen in front of me. Go ahead.
Okay, so which Roman numeral would you want to select first? Anyone care to give a guess to that?
I would want to say 1 and 3.
Okay, 1 or 3. All right. So here's the strategy that you want to employ here. Realizing that time is the issue. Okay? You want to pick the Roman numeral that's in only 2 answer choices first. Okay, so in this case, the correct answer is you should look at Roman numeral 3 first. In fact, I will go so far as to tell you, I'm pretty certain that Roman numeral 1 is going to be a true answer choice. Because think about what the average student's going to do. They're going to look at Roman numeral 1 first. It's in order. And they're going to tackle that problem first. They're going to find out it's true, and they've only eliminated 1 answer choice. Unfortunately, test writers are not very nice. They're not going to allow you to get by picking only 1 Roman numeral, especially the first Roman numeral, proving it to be false and getting the answer correct. So in this scenario, I would tackle Roman numeral 3 first. Okay? And if I prove Roman numeral 3, that eliminates me from having to look at Roman numeral 2 altogether. So once again, we're just saying a question type that's asking me and giving me some data on 3 Roman numerals, and I'm basically having to pick the correct answer. This strategy is going to work at pretty much any section of the MCAT. We even see these Roman numerals from time to time in the verbal section, which everybody hates. So now I'm effectively eliminating time that I'm spending per question because I don't have to evaluate Roman numeral 2. And earlier I said I was pretty sure Roman numeral 1 was correct, and I was pretty sure Roman numeral 2 is false. Once again, the strategy there is that I'm confident how the test is written. So one thing, if you listen to my first podcast that I talked to Dr. Dan about, is I can actually do an MCAT in half time. okay, and I'll score mid-30s usually. And the reason for that is because I can do questions like this. I already know the answer is probably going to be C in this case. Now, certainly I don't expect a student to do that because most students are not going to want to buy in completely to my philosophy. But at least buy into my philosophy of which question and which Roman numeral I approach first. So there's just another generic, that's a specific example of a question type. And there are many, many different question types. I don't have time to go through all of them, especially without content. It's kind of difficult to do that. But I want to make sure you're aware that there are strategies that get employed. And just from the two strategies I've shown so far, hopefully you realize there's a significant amount of time that we can save on this test. Not to mention, we're more likely to get the question right. All right, we'll go to my next slide here. So now I'm going to talk about some more general approaches. Now that I've gone through a couple of the specific approaches. And the other thing to keep in mind is there are many more approaches. We go through these approaches quite a bit in our program to make sure that our students are aware of them and can start practicing those techniques. Let me swing my mouse. There we go. Okay, so do I read the questions first? So what I'm talking about here is I've got a long passage. Let's say it's a science passage. And now do I go through and read the questions first or read the answers first? And that's a personal prerogative. That depends on what you want to do. I advise against doing this unless you're finishing the section with plenty of time left. It is going to take you more time to do that. And that skill takes a lot of time to develop as well, so lots of practice. Now, one thing that I can suggest is if you're doing a verbal section, you may want to glance at the questions first. And this is a personal choice. So here's a scenario I envision. I got a verbal passage. It's long. It's boring. It's about history, and I don't like history. And I glance over at the question. I look for those all caps, the question that says accept. Because a lot of times what the MCAT will do, it will say, the author discusses all the following except. To me, that's a trigger. I know I'm going to read that question first. And as I read the passage, I'm going to cross off answer choices for that question. So now I'm less likely to miss it. It is going to take me a little bit more time, but I'm getting that question right and not having to come back and reference into the passage. Now, some students like this strategy, others don't. It's definitely up to you to decide whether or not you want to approach that strategy. Personally, when I read verbal, Dan knows this as well, I actually don't read the passages. I just kind of glimpse through them. I don't advise doing that by any means. So I do think the opportunity is there to read the questions first. But remember, time is critical. We can't be spending too much time per passage, given that the average student is not meant to finish a section. So my next question is, do I go back to the passage and verify answers? This is a two-pronged approach. Let's talk about verbal first, and then let's talk about the sciences. For verbal, yes, you should go back to the passage. Okay? We'll have another question that deals with annotation here in a second. But you do need to go back to the passage and verify. In fact, in verbal, the writers are really good at writing answer choices that trigger memories of what was discussed in the passage. And so by adding in some buzzwords, all of a sudden I can convince the student that this topic was actually discussed when it was not. So for verbal, I think it is imperative that you go back to the passage. For the sciences, not as much. Because most of our science questions, we do have the ability to answer strictly based off of our knowledge. However, if I take an LSAT instructor, someone that teaches LSAT for a Princeton review, and I make them take the bio section, they'll actually score about an 8 usually, not having any science background. Because reading comprehension is actually really prevalent in the biology section. Unfortunately, most of our students don't want to think that and try to answer everything based on content. So it all comes back to timing. Do you have the time to go back? I think in verbal it's not an option. If that means you don't get to a passage, then so be it. It's much more important that we have a high accuracy with the questions that we do tackle. For the sciences, most students do have plenty of time, so it's okay to go back and verify. It takes a lot of practice to get into these habits, and we'll talk about annotation here in a second. Okay, so do I need to use figures? And so if I've got a figure in the biology section, maybe it's an organic chemistry passage, we're talking about enantiomers and chirality, do I need the figures? Generally speaking, on the MCAT, it's rare for them to put a figure in that you don't use at all. However, a lot of times, if you have really high content, you don't need to reference the figure because you already know it. So my rule of thumb that I teach to all of my students is go ahead and go back to figures, especially if you find yourself getting to the last question of the passage, say it's the 5th or 6th question, and you haven't used that weird figure You have no idea what that figure really is talking about, but you haven't used it yet. I will pretty much tell you that that last question is going to rely on that figure. Because as a writer, what I hope is that you've forgotten about that figure, and all of a sudden I ask this question, like, oh my God, this is the hardest question ever. The MCAT's so difficult, I don't know how to approach it. And so what we try to do is target that. And a lot of times you'll be surprised at how simple the question actually is if you reference the figure. We find this to be particularly problematic for engineering students who rely on content and knowledge and memorization to do well on their normal classwork. It's not going to cut it on the MCAT. You are going to have to go back and use those figures. Okay, what if I don't understand what a question is asking? And so all of a sudden, my figure question, right? I have no idea what it's talking about. First approach, think about figures. Do I have a figure that I need to go back and reference? Okay, let me do that. Now, if I still have no idea what a question is asking, try writing the question in your own words. One of the problems we see with pre-meds is they are hesitant to use their scratch paper. When I get done taking an MCAT, my scratch paper is completely filled. I'm jotting notes down. I'm numbering my questions as well, so if I need to come back to them, I can. And I think this is an imperative skill that a lot of pre-meds are lacking. So if you don't understand a question, try rewriting that question, try referencing a figure. If you find that you're unable to do either of those, it's now time to skip that question. Once again, we are referring to the science passages in this case. Okay, so how do I annotate a verbal passage? All right, there are many strategies that go into this. Now, a typical verbal section has 7 passages. The average student, the test is written so that they will only complete 6 of those passages. So they're guessing on a 7th passage. Now, it was very rare for me to find a student who can actually do all 7 passages and have time to spare. So we need to be realistic about our approach to verbal. In order to make sure that we can get these questions right, we are going to have to annotate what the passage is discussing. And this is because the writers of the MCAT are very good at triggering our memories and tying it back to an incorrect answer choice. So the way to beat this is annotation. So what I teach students to do is in the first paragraph, jot down what you think that paragraph is talking about on your scratch paper in anywhere from 5 to 10 words. It is going to take you more time, without a doubt, but now you're increasing your accuracy because you can reference back to the passage and use it a lot easier than if we did not have that annotation. So I'm very big on annotating. In fact, if you were to look at my verbal workbook where I've done passages, you'll see significant annotations that I have. And the reason for that is it helps me remember what the passage is talking about and come back to it and reference it. All right, so now we're on to test week. Okay, we're almost done today, so pretty quick, 25 minutes maybe. Okay, so it's on a test week. So what do I do the 24 to 48 hours before the MCAT? All right, so let's say I'm taking a test on a Saturday morning. Bottom line is you need to take Friday off. Okay, you can review a little bit in the morning, but you need to do something that's not going to mentally exhaust you. So what I tell my students, go to the spa. If that's your thing, go to the spa, get a treatment. Okay? You want to watch a movie, go watch a movie. You want to go watch a sporting event, go watch a sporting event. But you have to do something that is mentally relaxing. And here's the reason why. People always tell me, oh, I'm going to go to bed early all week in preparation for my MCAT. No matter what, when you get ready to go to bed the night before the MCAT, you will not sleep well because you're nervous. This is the biggest test you've ever taken in your life. You're going to not sleep well, and therefore you're going to be tired. That is why you can't be mentally tired as well from the previous day if you've been studying quite a bit. So take a step back. Let's say 48 hours before my MCAT. What do I review then? At that point, it is not about specific problems. It is about big concepts. So if you feel that you're particularly weak in a concept, it's now time to review it. For example, for those of you that know me, I hate physics. I don't like you if you like physics. I just don't get physics. Okay? So for me, 40 hours for my test, I'm frantically trying to remember something about light and optics and what an inverted image is, because I have no idea what it is. So I'm reviewing the big picture topics that I feel uncomfortable with. Okay? So those are my best points I can give you for the 24 to 48 hours before the MCAT. Okay, now it's test day. I walk in. The anxiety is all across the room. You can feel it. People are extremely nervous. Hell, you might see people crying, and that's something you actually have to prepare for. You will see people that lose their cool during the MCAT prep. You cannot let them affect you. So as soon as the proctor says go, What does the average student do? The average student quickly blitzes through the first passage and reads as quickly as they possibly can. If I'm taking the MCAT, as soon as that proctor tells me it's ready to go, I'm taking a deep breath and I'm counting to 10. And I'm relaxing myself and getting ready for it. And I'm not going to start with the first passage. Instead, I'm going to scroll through and find a passage that I feel very comfortable with. Psychology is incredibly important in any test. I've read several books on the psychology of test taking. So what I want to make sure that all of you grasp is that you cannot lose your cool in that first section, the second section either. You've got to make sure you stay focused on what the task is. So all of us have our strengths and weaknesses. For me, I'm a big GChem guy. I hate physics. I'm going to scroll through. I'm going to find a GChem passage that I feel comfortable with, and now I'm setting the bar. I'm doing that passage first. I feel good about myself because I now know the content that I'm approaching. And I'm going to work my way through my test. You'll hear many different strategies. Some people say start and just go. Some people say scroll through. Some people say go to the end and work backwards. There is really not a correct answer to that question. It's more of what you feel comfortable with. Personally, what I like to do is scroll through. Find a passage that I feel comfortable with and then tackle that passage. And that works well for me, but each of you needs to find what works best for you. Okay, I'm halfway through time-wise, but I have 2/3 of the questions left. What do I do? This is a terrible situation to be in. Okay? This is the situation that comes up when you don't accurately prepare for the MCAT and haven't been forcing yourself to keep track of the time that's occurred. This is a difficult situation to salvage. Now, you can go through these and go quickly, but at this point, you probably need to consider voiding your test. Okay? One of the worst things that can happen on any given section is for you to have to guess on more than 10 questions. If you find yourself having to guess on more than 10 questions, I would advise that you void your score at that point. Now, I am not a big fan of voiding scores at all, but there are certain instances when this comes up that it's relevant, and this is one of those instances. Okay, whenever you feel that you've left a significant number of questions blank or having to guess on a significant number. For me, a significant number in the sciences is 10 questions, and the verbal section is also 10 questions. All right, next. Now we're ready to open it up to your guys' questions that you have for me. So I just wanted to cover some specific test-taking skills and then some general test-taking skills.
Heather or Tony, do you have questions?
Can you repeat the Roman numeral tip again one more time really quickly?
Sure. Let me go back to it.
Sorry, am I holding things up? Should I wait till the end?
You know what? This is not going to work that way. Let's just do this. Roman numeral. Okay. So if I'm asking a question, which of the following Roman numerals is correct?
Mm-hmm.
So I've given you example data here, okay, and just imagine it's there. So 1, 2, and 3. I'm going to say 1 for something about GChem, 2 is GChem, 3 is GChem. I'm asking which of the following is true. The typical pre-med is going to start with Roman numeral 1 and try and prove or disprove it. What I'm saying is the Roman numeral you start with is the Roman numeral that's in only 2 of these answer choices. So in that case, Roman numeral 3 is the Roman numeral I should attack first. Because if I prove it or disprove it, I'm down to 50-50, and I've maximized the efficiency of my work.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right,
I
no
have a
problem.
pre-answer, so that's why I didn't understand. Sorry.
Okay, no problem.
Go ahead.
Heather, do you have a question?
Any other questions?
I actually do not have a question because yeah, I don't. Anybody else?
I have a question, rather a comment that I wanted to put down. And I think it's the previous slide, Chris, if you go back to the one that talks about the accept type question. Yeah, that's it. On this one, you know, when it says all the following are true except, that's a real common question. And when you get into medical school, you see this question 20 times on one test. It's very common, and guaranteed, you know, people every time are going to miss 1 or 2 of them because they make that mistake of forgetting that it was an accept question. You're just tired or you're nervous or whatever, And so I just kind of wanted to reiterate what Chris already said, is what I do when I get to this is I totally change the whole thing in my mind and say, okay, this is true or false. And I literally will go along, I'll read answer choice A, and I'll put a T out to the side of it if I think it's true, and an F if I think it's false. If I don't know, I put a question mark, and I just go down that way. That way I totally get away from that, all the following are true except, so I don't confuse myself or anything. And sometimes I've caught myself kind of forgetting what I was looking for, a true statement or a false statement, and then I'll notice I have all 3 true statements and 1 false, and it's just another way to check yourself.
And I agree with that completely. You've got to rewrite these questions. On the MCAT, we use our scratch paper. The test I can actually write on, I think Dan's idea is an excellent idea of writing next to each answer choice, true or false.
Yeah, I did that in medical school pretty much all the way through once I figured that one out. The other comment I had is about, let's say in verbal reasoning, whether or not you should take the time to kind of, as you said, glance at the maybe first paragraph of a verbal passage, say it's a whole page or something, just to kind of see what the general topic is, and then should you go and look at the questions to see what kind of questions you're about to have to answer about, and then read the whole passage. So you're kind of jumping back and forth. And for me, I agree, there's not a hard and fast rule that's going to fit everyone, but what I've noticed in myself is that in thinking of how to explain to folks, you've been doing it for a long time, but I'm a little new to teaching how to teach a test. What am I thinking on a test? Usually that moment is so full of nervousness, and attention, is hard to explain. But I was able to do it and realize that what I'm doing on a test is I sort of have what I call a floating consciousness or focus. That is, it's almost like biofeedback, where I'm aware when I start getting bored or distracted, or I'm not really understanding what I just read, you know what I mean? And so if I am 100% geared up, let's say I've had my coffee and I am ready to take it on, I'll just read from from the top to the bottom. I can take it. I'm not being distracted. I'm absorbing what I need to. But about halfway through the test, I'll start losing my energy. And you can't really do it on the MCAT, but you can on other tests, in medical school and stuff. Take a bathroom break or look up at the ceiling, stretch. Just take 30 seconds off. Give yourself a little break. Or if you're doing a Scantron type test, that's the time to take a break and just fill in the bubbles on your Scantron, triple checking yourself as you go. You'll learn a little system. But so if you ask me, do I look at the questions first, it kind of depends question to question, whether we're talking about the beginning of the test hour or two or towards the end. I mean, we'll take 3-hour tests sometimes in med school. Hopefully you can finish it within about 2. But that's a lot of attention. And so whenever I'm bored and I'm really fatigued, I'm aware of it. And I jump around a lot at that point. I'm like, what do you want to know? Let me see if I can find it. You know what I mean? So I hope that makes sense.
No, I think that's some good advice. I think every student should at least try it on a couple of passages and see how it goes. Unfortunately, it's so radical. Because think about a test you take in class. You never go back and read questions and come through if it's based on a passage or a topic. And so it's so ingrained in students' heads just to go one by one. I think it is something that every student should at least attempt, is to go through and read the questions first. And that's a great strategy to at least start with.
Right, and we're talking about the questions, not all the answer choices, right?
Right, just the questions.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, Chris.
Yes.
Hi, Chris. This is Nadine. I actually, I came in late, so you may have covered this earlier. However, I've taken the MCAT before, and one of the things that I've identified as a personal weakness is timing. So I know the concepts, and it's like I could answer the question, but, I'm finding that I wasn't quite at the situation where you're talking about, 2/3 of the questions were, running out. But I have been in a situation where it's like, I have about a passage or two that I can't answer because, the time is running out. So how do I really address the timing issue? Or do you have any strategies to address that?
Well, one thing is to use these types of strategies that Dan and I were discussing earlier, like all the following are true except, and how you approach certain types of questions. But the bigger picture is you have to get yourself used to spending a certain amount of time per passage. So if I have a student that's particularly struggling with timing, I'll make them get a stopwatch. And I'll actually tell them, per passage, you get 2 minutes to read it and 1 minute per question. And as they do their homework, they set that stopwatch. And it shocks them at first. Like, wow, I didn't get through nearly as much as I thought I was going to get through. And by practicing with that stopwatch, they learn to work quicker and more efficiently. It is a painful process to go through. I mean, you're going to need to do 30 to 40 passages with that stopwatch so that it becomes second nature, that you're used to spending that appropriate amount of time. Now, another approach is that you can target the particular passage that's incredibly difficult to you. Certain people have preferences. And maybe you just say, okay, I'm going to guess just on that passage all the way through. And I always joke with my students, guess C for Chris. No real reason, but I'm Chris, so why not? But you can go through and target now and spend more time on your other passages. I only advise that if you're having a high amount of accuracy when you do take your time on the passages. So a couple of different approaches. It just kind of depends upon your personal weaknesses or strengths. And I hope that answered your question. I don't know if it did.
No,
That was
yeah,
a very...
no, definitely. Yeah.
Go ahead, Nadine.
No. I've taken Princeton review, so it's something that I've heard before. So it's I didn't quite. It's kind of interesting because the syllabus with Princeton review, they kind of start you off on doing that, and then they tell you to, they basically tell you then you don't have to do it any longer. So it's great to hear that.
And that's true. That is the goal, is that you do it and you get used to it so you don't have to do it anymore. And depending on the student, I may give them an extra minute. I may say 3 minutes per passage, and then 3 minutes to read the passage and 1 minute per question.
So, I mean, and that's because I feel like they focused on that in like verbal, but not necessarily as much focus as in the sciences, the physical sciences and the biological sciences. So is there a similar type of formula for the biological sciences as well as the physical sciences? Like,
yes, I would still use that same formula of 3 minutes or 2 minutes per passage and 1 minute per question. But what we generally find is that students are not running out of time in the biology section, and they're cutting it pretty close in the physical sciences section. But if I were to deal with a student who's spending a lot of time and is actually not getting to a passage in either of the sciences, then I would still employ that trick of 2 minutes per passage, 1 minute per question, and force them to practice with the stopwatch and use that.
Gotcha. Also, I'm sorry to monopolize everything. I have another question with that. How many times do you recommend taking the MCAT before you actually take it? Because sometimes I hear people saying like, oh, you should be taking MCATs like once a week before going up to the exam. Other times, like I've actually had a friend who's taught for Princeton Review, and she's like, well, I only I only took like 1 or 2 before the actual exam. So what do you think is a good number?
Sure, I can answer that question. Okay, so the typical student's going to have access to probably 15 tests. You're taking a prep class, whether it's Kaplan or Princeton Review. We'll go with those to start with. I think you'll have access to like 17 or 18 tests. So should you take every test? Emphatically, the answer is no. You do not take every one of those tests. So the general rule, and this is coming from my experience of having taught as long as I have, I suggest 6 tests. And maybe, you do plus or minus 2 from there. And the reason why I don't go higher is that if you're not really reviewing your test, then you're just reinforcing bad behavior. Okay? If you actually take the time to go over your test, we talked about this in the last podcast I did for Dan. If you take your time to go over your test, you actually get benefits from it. Because a lot of times the students are only hung up on the score they achieved on the practice test, not how they got that score or why they got that score. Now, lower than 4, I advise against because you're not getting enough practice. There are only so many ways you can write an MCAT question, and you'll notice they start to repeat themselves. In fact, I've gotten to the point where I can look at certain questions, already know where the answer is probably going to be, purely based on the fact I've done like 60,000 MCAT problems. Now, trust me, you don't want to do that. And you don't want to practice that much that you're nailing down so many questions. But I think a good number is 6 practice tests. And I think, on top of that, the last 3 practice tests need to be AAMC tests, specifically tests 8, 9, and 10. Because the earlier AAMC tests are too easy compared to the real MCAT. From our experience, the numbers that we've run across, the most predictable test, the one that's the most accurate to a student's actual MCAT score, is AAMC Test 9. So that would be the last test that I would take if I were preparing for the MCAT.
Yeah, I want to. Yeah, I want to kind of summarize some of the things you've been saying. I sort of use different words, and my little logical brain can kind of separate out all that's been talked about here tonight. What we're talking about is learning the content, which is totally separate from test-taking skills. Under the content learning, piece of, all the groundwork you have to do to get ready for something like an MCAT, it's really 2 things. There's science review, which of course comes from your classes and maybe review books or review course or something like that. And then in general for verbal, lots of reading, good stuff too, like Atlantic Monthly, New York Times, something to be an avid reader. Those from the humanities backgrounds or philosophy or literature usually do real well, kind of naturally. And the point is you want to start doing real practice MCAT questions as early as you can in that review process until you're getting a high percentage of accuracy while you're taking your time. When you notice you're starting to get a little better at that, then it's time to start shifting into real test-taking skills. And part of test-taking skills isn't just, how should I approach the question or how do I manage my time. It's actual practicing and timing practice exams, either fully linked sections or full-length exam themselves the closer you get. How much time will it take? I mean, you're only going to really know how much time you need if you waited too late. It's better to start early. I think in general, I am exactly the average student that Chris is describing, and I've done all the things he's talking about. And I wish I'd known Chris back then because I pretty much focused on content. If I studied 300 hours, which I probably did, I probably spent 250 or 60 of them on content. I did not split those 300 hours up very well towards test-taking skills. And using real AAMC released MCATs is a fantastic idea. Thank you so much for that tip about those 3 tests, and especially number 9 being so predictive. But by the end of this, by the time you're really ready for this MCAT, whether it's weeks ahead of time, hopefully, or definitely a couple of weeks out, you should have such a familiarity, not just with the content in the test, but with yourself, with your own habits, with your own preferences for types of questions, types of passages, where your strengths and weaknesses are. You should have taken so many practice questions and passages that you know without looking at a clock within about 20 or 30 seconds of how long it's taking you to get through. So you sort of develop this internal clock, and you know where you are without looking at a clock. How's that sound, Chris?
Sounds pretty good.
Is it possible?
It is definitely possible. It takes practice, though, and you may or may not need external assistance, whether that's a prep class, tutoring, online forums, or even the things that you offer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of us, we're type A personalities, and if we're applying to medical school, that means we've probably been able to achieve some high grades in areas when we really put our attention on it. So we tend to think, oh, I can do this. I mean, that's what I've noticed, and the majority of the people that really send me the longest emails are the ones that thought they could do it until they got themselves into trouble, a low score, whether it's in the medical school licensing exams or the MCATs or the GPAs. They sort of get into trouble first. So how would a person know if they're brand new to this process, Chris, whether they should seek out help, whether it's a Princeton review class or something like that? I mean, you really don't want to wait till MCAT day and have to avoid your score.
I agree. I think under rare circumstances, In fact, I don't think I know someone personally who could have taken the MCAT and done well without any external help. I firmly believe you've got to review the material of some sort. Now, there are many, many options out there. It comes down to discipline. Are you disciplined enough that you will force yourself to start studying 3 months before this exam and study at a high level all the way through? I didn't find myself to be too disciplined. I didn't go to classes at my prep class. If I had forced myself to do so, my score would have been higher. Okay? Now, I do believe, though, you need to think about how much you know on the content side and whether you need a thorough review or you kind of get it. The best way I found for a student to realize that is AAMC Test 5. Okay, I think that's a pretty good test for gauging baseline content. And if you take that test and you don't score above 15, you need a thorough prep class. Score 15 to 20, you probably need a moderate prep class. Above a 20 on that particular test, it's easier than the real MCAT, by the way, then you probably don't need any prep class. You can probably pick up things on your own. But you need to take a practice test to get a gauge of where you stand. And I advise against taking any prep classes test as your first test to gauge your ability, because those tests are definitely harder than the real MCAT. So AAMC Test 5 is a test that I actually recommend.
That's awesome expertise, Chris. Thanks for sharing that.
No problem.
Where can they get these tests? I'm sure that's the next question. I see some people are typing in that. Where's the best place they can locate those tests?
Okay, so good question. So a prep class, okay, from experience, I know that Exam Crackers, Princeton Review, and Kaplan provide you access to those tests. Other test prep companies, I just don't know. So that's one question I would definitely ask to any test prep company: do I get access to those tests? And if they don't provide them, or if they don't provide them, honestly, I wouldn't consider that program anymore. I need to have access to those tests. You can buy those tests from AAMC.org, or it's actually, the link will take you to e-mcat.com, and you can buy a bundle of those tests. Now, AAMC Test 3, 4, 5, and 6, they are a lot easier than the real MCAT. Okay? So I don't know if it's worth purchasing those tests necessarily unless I'm trying to gauge my abilities, which Test 5 is the best one for that. But 8, 9, and 10, those are absolutely worth every penny to buy those tests, because those are the most realistic MCATs that are out there. And Dan, I don't see their questions, by the way.
Okay. Yeah, they're kind of summarizing what you're talking about too. You guys have any more questions? Let me make sure I've got everybody unmuted. Let me hear your questions. Now's your chance to ask the expert.
Could I ask a question?
Yes, go
Sure,
ahead.
go for it.
Okay. About the specific test-taking strategies, the slide that's currently open, I took it your point to mean that when you're approaching the question, regardless of the content, you can predict that the answer could be either B or D.
No. In this case, it was C or D. I'm willing to bet the answer is C or D in this particular example, and the strategy is to start working from the bottom up.
Oh, I see.
Right?
So would you start from D, then go to C, or?
Exactly. I would start with D first and see if I can prove that it's false, and then C and prove that it's false, and then B, but I'm telling you the answer is probably C or D.
Oh, okay. I thought originally, I thought you said that it was B or D, and I was going to ask why it wouldn't be C, but
no, that might actually be the next slide. Let me see what the next slide was. So in the next slide, I was willing to bet the answer involved when we, actually, sorry, no, in this case, I pretty much knew it was C. Yeah, so that didn't work. Never mind. But yeah, the strategy for that previous example is that you do want to, that you would want to start, where you go, start from the bottom and work your way up.
Mm-hmm. Do you know where you can get more tips like about specific questions and how to approach them? if I'm not enrolled in your class or anything like that?
That's a really interesting question. People have actually told me I should write a book about this. I've never gotten around to that. There isn't any source of that. Basically, you'd have to know someone like myself or someone who can really take tests well and be able to extrapolate some of these strategies. These strategies that I am showing you guys now, not even every Princeton Review instructor is going to have all of these. It just depends on what type of program you're in. So there really isn't a good avenue for this right now, unfortunately.
Actually, there's a fairly recent book out by Brett Ferdinand and Dr. Flowers. Dr. Flowers wrote the first MCAT prep book ever in the 1970s, and they teamed up and came out with a book called The Silver Bullet, Real MCATs Explained. And I haven't read it. You guys are going to be our best test to find out if you think this is a good book. Honestly, I'm sitting here with an extra copy he gave me, and their point is they take real AAMC released MCAT questions and they go through and they explain test-taking skills comment. So, in other words, the right approach for this kind of question. They explain that, and they also explain why each of the other answer choices are incorrect. So I think that's about the closest thing we've got to a source like that. It's called The Silver Bullet.
I haven't read that book, but my one problem is with what you just said, though, is when you take the MCAT, you should never try to figure out why every other answer choice is wrong. That's actually a very poor approach.
No, this would be early in your practice and exposure to MCAT questions. Of course, you don't have time to do that during a test.
Right, so just make sure you don't do that, but I still think the book can be valuable. I have not seen that book.
I think it's just better for elucidating and bringing out into the open the inner workings of the mind of a person that does know how to figure these things out. So say somebody like you doesn't have a lot of practice, problem solving with questions like these. I think that might be a pretty good source. If you read the whole thing, it might give you a few take-home points that would help. Who knows?
And practice is the key, too, because once you start to practice these things, you can start to recognize some of these trends. I wish I had a better answer for you. I'm sorry that I don't.
That's okay.
I think you have the best answer. It's just not an easy one. Practice is something that nobody wants to do in this country anymore. We just all want the rewards. And we have got to learn how to work for what we want. And, hey, if it takes me 7 full-length MCATs with a stopwatch to get my goal, that's what I want you guys to do. You know what I mean?
Do you think that if a person theoretically takes a test and then reviews it so that if they were taking, say, that same test again, they would understand exactly how to answer each question conceptually?
I actually advise against taking a test again because you'll remember specifics and tricks about it. And that's why I train my students to go over each test many times to try to go over it, not many times, sorry, go over it thoroughly, to spend a lot of time going over it. In fact, I actually tell my students they should spend 3 hours going over a test. So since you're taking it again, because if you retake it, you know the tricks, and your score is going to be inflated a lot, and it's not going to be representative of what you're going to score on the real MCAT. So you've got to spend the time to go over those questions. In my previous podcast, I explicitly go over the types of questions and how you should analyze your test. And I think if you do that, you'll start to understand the big picture conceptually. So just, for example, I get a question, I have no idea what it's talking about, I missed it. That now tells me I need to review that concept. So on my scratch paper, I'm noting down what that concept was, and then I can go back and review that particular concept. So the next time I get a question on that concept, hopefully I'm able to nail it down.
Okay.
The way I like to think of it is when I'm getting ready to do some practice questions, instead of saying, how many questions do I have time to go through right now? Maybe I'm going to dinner later or something. I got an hour or whatever. I change that question to how many questions do I have time to review right now? And you find out that, oh, yeah, I could do 3 passages in the next hour. Sure, no problem. But if I was to thoroughly research the answers and understand what I was thinking and what I was doing and learn from it, I could probably only do one passage in about 30, 45 minutes, to thoroughly understand it. That's just an estimate.
Do you tell your students to go over the questions they got right and spend time reviewing that just as much of the ones that they got wrong?
No, it depends. So if I got a question right because I guessed on it, then absolutely I want them to review it completely. But if I got a question right and I understood the answer that is correct, then I don't think you should review it. And that's why I'm very worried about students who try to prove why every answer is wrong. Because the way the MCAT is written, that can be a real problem for a student, and it can be a real time waste and a point of confusion. So if I feel I understood a topic correctly and I got the question right, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going back over it.
I see.
Is you're that smart and you just get it, and you're probably socially awkward when you can't talk to people, because the amount of knowledge you'd have to have the undergraduate level to score 40 plus on the MCAT is astronomical. The other way you can achieve such a high score is if you teach a test. Because you teach a test, you're really diving into it. I was told by a Texas medical school, who will remain anonymous, that they would not consider me for an interview based on my MCAT score, it's in that 40 plus range, if they didn't know who I was. And the reason for that, as they said, in their experience, and this is straight from a dean of a school, the types of students that score that high are the two categories you just leveled out to me. Because out of the undergrad level, when you get older, obviously people can kind of, have, if I have a PhD in something, I bet I can do really well in the MCAT. So the difference between a 35 and a 40 plus is actually pretty significant. It's pretty small percentage-wise. In fact, most schools just group a 35 and above as 35 and above, and they don't dive into it too much. But I thought it was really interesting to find out that certain schools would actually hold it against you if you scored 41, 42, 43 on the MCAT.
Why, when does a person cross over into the realm of being a teacher of the MCAT? Because you're both exposed to the same materials to study, correct?
No, not at all. In fact, so I'm a trainer. So if you want to teach the MCAT, you have to go through someone like me. And so every one of my trainees is taking the MCAT, and they pretty much tell me in the one weekend that they spend with me going over the MCAT, they learned more than they did their entire time studying for the MCAT. Because you actually dive into the traps. You talk about, you have to take the mindset of a student, and you have to be prepared for those students' questions and now anticipate them and be able to answer them. So teaching the MCAT and scoring well on the MCAT are actually not always directly correlated. But after teaching the MCAT, anyone who's taught it should have their score go up 3 to 5 points just from the experience of teaching it one time.
So would you say there's a lot more pitfalls that and traps that you haven't mentioned, say, like in today's presentation, that everybody else is not aware of?
I'd say there's quite a few, yes. Dr. Dan knows this. I made this presentation right before I sent it to him today. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to go through it. There are about a dozen types of questions that you can go through and look at what is probably going to be the correct answer. So, for example, the one I'm showing right now. I only did a couple of examples in the interest of time.
So to learn that, I would have to take the Princeton Review MCAT class, is what you're saying?
I mean, not just Princeton Review. Any prep class with a good teacher is going to be able to teach you some of these strategies. I happen to be one of the senior-most instructors for the Princeton Review, and having done it as long as I have. I mean, there aren't many people that will say they've been teaching MCAT for 9 years or 8 years.
Okay.
I will have to say, though, as a former Princeton Review student, I personally recommend it. And I also had Chris as an instructor.
There it is. I was waiting for it.
Yeah,
I take full credit for her interviews.
And tell us your score, Heather.
No, the MCAT, you can take full credit for the MCAT, but the interviews is all Dr. Dan.
Yeah. It's not a bad partnership, is it?
That works.
No.
She can fly to Austin or wherever Chris is going and take his class and learn our skills for how to write up your success stories and interview. You'd be golden.
Oh yeah, and I'll
And
tell you,
Heather
my
actually-
MCAT, what?
Heather, I taught both your subjects, right? GChem and OChem.
Yeah.
You did it twice. It's pretty rare to have that happen these days.
I know. I felt very lucky.